Well, again, good evening, friends. Welcome to tonight. So our goal this evening is to get us right up to the foundation of the Southern Baptist Convention. So this will be my last night teaching on Sunday night, and then I believe Dr. Matz is going to pick up either next week or relatively soon to kind of walk you all through the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention specifically. So I've got about, 40 minutes to talk about 75, 80 years, trying to, get us to the end of the 1700s up to the mid-1800s when we start looking at the events that kind of lead up to the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, let me start just real briefly by opening my can of Dr. Pepper. Let's get that hiss out of the way at the beginning. But let me start just, again, kind of where we left off last week, just real briefly. We were talking about how as the United States is kind of moving into the War of Independence and then coming out of the War of Independence, Baptists find themselves growing exponentially in the original 13 colonies, now 13 states, particularly as a result of the Great Awakenings. So you kind of have the first Great Awakening, if you remember, that happens before kind of early 1700s, right up until the War of Independence, and then it kind of gets put on hold, obviously. There's a war going on. But then, generally speaking, we kind of date the Second Great Awakening and just a few years after the War of Independence ends, and we get into what American historians call the Early Republic. Early Republic is that period kind of from the Constitution up to the Civil War. And so, as we're kind of bridging this event, as America has become its own independent nation, Baptists are growing and adapting to this new world. Now, it's not a brand new world, right? So one of the interesting things, I'm getting ready, starting tomorrow, to start teaching U.S. History 1 at HLG, which takes us from the colonial period up through either to or through the Civil War, depending on how long-winded I am. But up to or up through the Civil War. And when we talk about the War of Independence, one of the things I try to stress to these students is that the War of Independence is not like the French Revolution, right? So that's one of the reasons I try to always call it the War of Independence, the U.S. War of Independence, the American War of Independence, because it's not really a revolution in the modern sense of the word, right? So, I mean, Adams called it a revolution. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad word to use, but the word, when we think of the word revolution, we think of it in kind of a post-French Revolution world, particularly when we look at the Bolshevik Revolution in World War I, Communist Revolution in China and Southeast Asia, in Latin America. And revolution, in my mind, kind of comes to mean an attempt to completely upend the established norms of a society. It's not just replacing a government, which is what we see in the War of Independence, but it's an upending of a worldview, right? It's something radically different. So in the U.S. War of Independence, one of the things that we see is that the Americans, as much as we like to think of them as radical and revolutionaries, they really weren't. They were, from the very beginning, insisting on their rights as Englishmen, right? Like they're the conservatives, in the mix, if you were. It was Parliament who were being the radicals. It was the independence movement that were more. Now there were radical revolutionary elements within the War of Independence and within the independence movement, but generally speaking, they were attempting to return back to and establish their God-given rights as humans, first and foremost, but also within the English tradition. So, as Baptists are beginning to move and breathe and operate in this new old world, right? So it's a new world in some sense, but it's old in another sense, right? One of the things we find is the emergence of the Second Great Awakening, another kind of probably what we would say an even more radical, even more kind of exuberant and spontaneous revival movement, but that's particularly not contained to New England and the kind of the eastern seaboard like the first revolution. The Second Great Awakening moves west. Why? Because everybody else is also moving west, right? In the growth of the United States during the early Republic period, and Baptists are kind of emerging and moving along with them. One of the things that we see in this period, so again, by this period, I'm talking about after the War of Independence, as America's a new nation, and as the Second Great Awakening is beginning to emerge, we see tremendous, phenomenal growth of Baptists, and with that comes new questions and new complications, right? So that's kind of what I want to really focus on tonight, is one of those particular questions, one of those particular conflicts. But before I do that, I want to give you a sense of, look for our marker, a sense of when I say exponential growth, right? Like Baptists are growing exponentially during this period. What exactly is it that I'm talking about? So, in let's say the seven, now these are, I'm going to give you the number, estimated number, emphasis, underline, highlight, italicize, red arrow, the word estimate, right? But estimated number of Baptist churches within America, okay? Now, remember at this point, it's not really until we get to the early 1800s. At this point, Baptists have not started forming national conventions or national associations, what we would maybe think of as denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention. That hasn't really happened yet. So broadly speaking, these Baptist churches are really only associating at the local level, okay? So we don't really have conventions or or large conventions or denominations of Baptists yet. That happens in the 1800s. But in the 1700s, so we're really talking about individual Baptist churches. And these could be churches in the north, these could be churches in the south, these can be regular Baptist churches, these could be separate Baptist churches. If they're in the south, these could be, remember the Charleston tradition or the Sandy Creek tradition. This is just kind of everybody, okay? So when we're looking at the beginning of the 18th century, the early 1700s, we can estimate about 24 Baptist churches within the American colonies, okay? Now, I don't know, some of you may know, Brother Larry, you may know, how many churches are in the Bethel Association? 30 some odd? Right, so fewer churches than here locally, fewer Baptist churches than just in our local Southern Baptist Association. These are roughly all the Baptist churches in, at this time, the British colonies in North America, okay? Now, jump forward about 40 years, so by 1740, we're looking at, again, estimate probably around 60 churches. So not bad, okay? Now, 1740s is about when we're looking at the beginning of the First Great Awakening, okay? So it hasn't really hit full steam yet, but that's kind of how, that's about the same time. So we could say at the beginning of the First Great Awakening, we're looking at about 60 Baptist churches in America, okay? Now, by 1776, right, so by the opening of the War of Independence, and we'll say at the end of the First Great Awakening, we're looking at about 497 Baptist churches in America. So when I talk about the exponential growth, and that's just the First Great Awakening, okay? That's kind of what we're looking at. Sorry, that was probably me. Okay, So by the time we get to the end of the century, by the end of the 1700s, that growth continues. Okay, so after the War of Independence and the beginning of the early republic, you have kind of like the beginnings, the early stages of the Second Great Awakening. This number pops to about 750 Baptist churches in the United States. Okay? Still not a lot, relatively speaking, kind of in our mind. That this is, I think there's something in the neighborhood of about 1,200 Baptist churches in the Missouri Baptist Convention, like right now, somewhere in that neck of the woods, we'll say. Okay? So, 750, but if we're talking just within 100 years, that's a fair amount of growth. And remember, these are churches, right? So there's a lot of people attached to these, okay? 50 years later, so by the 1850s, okay? Now this is one of the, as radical and as much growth happens in the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening even more so, because the Second Great Awakening you have other external factors, such as kind of mass migration from European countries. You have continued westward expansion. You have the kind of ballooning of the population in the United States. There's a lot of factors in this, but part of it is the continuance of the Second Great Awakening. So all that to say, by the time we get to the 1850s, we're looking at over 9,000 churches. Over 9,000 churches in the United States by the time we get to the 1850s. So basically, by the time we get to just before, about 10 years before the Civil War. So, okay. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot of growth, and it's spread out, right? And it grows as the nation grows, right? So this is the reason why, even though when we've looked chronologically at the beginnings of the Baptist tradition here in the United States, we're looking at places like New England, like Massachusetts, right? Even Philadelphia. We look at these major kind of East Coast cities. By the time we get to the 1800s, the number of Baptists in many of these cities is not, at this point, it's not shrinking. That doesn't really happen until the 1900s, but it kind of levels out. Whereas Baptists are continuing to grow exponentially in the Midwest, in the South, and even out west in westward expansion, okay? So any questions at this point? All right, so as we get to the end of the 1700s, as we get into the 1800s, we find the number of Baptist, sorry, Colton, if I'm kicking something. The number of Baptist churches continue to grow, and as these churches grow and spread with the country, again, they're still not associating much on the national level. Most of their associations are local. By the time we get to the first couple decades of the 1800s, you're just then starting to see associations forming at the state level, right? So kind of state conventions, as we would call them, kind of predate national conventions or national associations. So for instance, just as one example, so I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but the Southern Baptist Convention forms in 1845, okay? The Missouri Baptist Convention, their first annual meeting was in 1835, right? So the Missouri Baptist Convention predates the Southern Baptist Convention, right? In terms of when churches of Missouri begin to associate together for missions and for accountability within states. And so because of this, remember how we were talking about you always have different streams and different trajectories within the Baptist tradition. As we approach the 1800s, one of the things that we start seeing within Baptist life is that these traditions begin to map out on geographic lines, which shouldn't be super surprising. So you'll start seeing, so for instance, if you find yourself with some free time, and you look at some Baptist state newspapers that are being published in the early to mid 1800s, one of the things that you'll see is that churches or conventions that are publishing these Baptist newspapers in places like Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, certain areas kind of become hubs. So again, Georgia is a big one, Tennessee is a big one, Texas, and what comes with them is even more kind of theological eccentricities with them as well. We're not going to get into all of them at this point, but as much as we talked about the divergence of the Charleston tradition and the Sandy Creek tradition in the South, just know that there's even other kind of streams and tributaries and subsets rolling off of these kind of major foundations as well. So what I'm getting at here is with growth comes diversity. And with diversity, which is a good thing, comes complexity, right? And so one of the big issues that Baptists come into and hit pretty hard, kind of like a brick wall, in the 1800s is the issue of missions. Okay, now you would think that what's there to argue about with missions? Well, Baptists, we find a way, right? What's there to argue about with missions, right? So the first National Association of Baptist Churches, I shouldn't say the first, probably one of the first, the earliest one that survives for any period of time. That's probably the better way to put it. The first one to survive at any period of time. This is the beginning of kind of Baptist denominationalism, Baptist kind of national conventions or national associations. It all begins in 1814 with the Triennial Convention. Now, the Triennial Convention is the shorthand name for lazy Baptist historians like me that don't want to write out a lot of words. Because technically, the full name was the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist Denomination in the United States of America. But we're going to call it the Triennial Convention. And we call it the Triennial Convention because at the time, it met every 3 years, hence Triennial Convention, right? So let me give you a little background before we kind of dig into the bones of the Triennial Convention. So essentially what the Triennial Convention is that Baptist churches, well, let me say this. Baptists and Baptist churches and Baptist associations and conventions wanted to pool together money, resources, time to be able to send missionaries overseas, right? That's generally speaking, that's the goal, right? They wanted to be able to pool together financial resources, but also pool together other resources to create mission agencies that would certify and train missionaries, right? Because the model had always been previously, right? You have a church, you have a young man, young woman within your church, they feel called to missions, and you would raise them up, you would train them, you would educate them, you would support them, and then you would send them out. Usually, sometimes they would raise some money, but primarily sponsored by a church. And so typically, the way that would pan out is that a church could support a missionary for the life of that missionary, right? But as we get into the 1700s and as we get into the 1800s, now, this is not just Baptist churches, but many denominations began to come together, and multiple churches would pool their resources together to more effectively and honestly more quickly approve, train, and then send out missionaries. So rather than one church sending out one missionary, 8 churches could send out 20. Does that make sense? It's kind of that exponential growth of pooled resources. And so the Triennial Convention was, amongst Baptist churches in America, the first kind of national attempt to do that. They had done it on, again, local association levels, state convention. There were state mission boards. So the Georgia Baptist Mission Board, the Alabama Mission Board, I think both of those kind of rise up about the same time as the Triennial Convention. I think Alabama might even be a little bit older. I'm not 100% sure there. But the Triennial Convention is one of the earliest kind of large-scale national efforts by Baptists in order to equip and send out missionaries. Now, again, the Triennial Convention is really, even though it's the first big national American attempt, it's not the only one. The Triennial Convention had a couple predecessors, okay? So one of them, probably the earliest Baptist predecessor to something like the Triennial Convention, was the English Baptist Association. It was a group of English Baptists who came together to fund the sending of missionaries at first to India, but eventually to other nations. And this is kind of, we can blame the English. This is where we get our propensity of having long name things. But this early British Baptist Mission Agency, this was established in 1792. It was called the Particular Baptist. So remember the Particular Baptists, right? It was the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Amongst the Heathen. Right? They don't name them like that anymore. All right? Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Amongst the Heathen. That one was started 1792. Let me make sure I got that right. Yep, 1792, right? So end of the 1700s. And so how many of you have heard of William Carey, right? So the great British missionary, William Carey. This is the association of missionaries that sent out William Carey and others, right? So the first missionary sent out by this group is, again, William Carey, also John Thomas. They were sent to Bengal, India, in 1793. And so they were followed by many other co-workers, but first they went to India. Eventually, this missions agency sent British Baptists to Asia, the Caribbean, to Africa, to other spots in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, South America. Now, again, even these British Baptists thought that the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Amongst the Heathens was a little bit long-winded. So eventually, they renamed it the Baptist Missionary Society. That sounds a lot better, right? So the Baptist Missionary Society eventually even sent missionaries to China, right? So for instance, they opened up Chinese missions in 1860. So now this is down the road a little bit, but so of course we all know the name Lottie Moon. So Lottie Moon's work is she kind of travels in the wake of a lot of these early BMS, a lot of these early Baptist Missionary Society English missionaries that went to China. They began operating, for instance, like in the Shanghai province in 1770, and were there really up until the Boxer Rebellion in the 1700s, where basically all the BMS missionaries there in China were killed during the Boxer Rebellion. So that's one early example, right? So again, the Baptist Missionary Society, or Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Amongst the Heathens, right? Now, in America, you also have the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, also very long name, right, by the ABCFM, right? Now, that group is founded in 1810, so it predates the Triennial Convention by a little bit. Now, this group is a little different because, now, if you remember, I don't want to get into it too much to take up too much time, but if you remember, one of the things that the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening did was create a theological movement that transcended traditional denominations. So in other words, what we call today kind of evangelicalism, right? And so what the First and Second Great Awakening did in kind of creating this category of evangelicalism is it allowed individuals from different denominations to at least have similar categories of what the gospel is. How is a person saved? They may have differences in terms of their ecclesiology, of how the church works, and these sorts of things, but at least they're similar enough in their doctrine of salvation that they can at least attempt to come together for some common efforts, such as missions. And so the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, founded in 1810, is an example of one of these groups. It's not one denomination, it's a bunch of denominations came together, again, for mutual support, for pooling of money and resources to be able to send missionaries. Now, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, the ABCFM is the largest and probably most important American missionary organization. And it consisted of Protestants from a variety of especially Reformed traditions. So you have Presbyterians, you have Congregationalists, you have German Reformed churches, and so on. And they sent missionaries internationally, but also commissioned missionaries to Native American tribes here in the United States, again, particularly as we're pushing westward and coming into the generous word is contact with Native American tribes in the West, but also sent missionaries even to Hawaii and some of the Peloponnesian islands in the Pacific. Now, you would think that maybe this is the kind of situation, right? That here we have a national group of evangelical churches, different denominations, yes, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, German Reformed churches. You had this national group of evangelical churches who are kind of coming together to support missionaries and sending missionaries overseas. You would think that Baptist churches would be able to, kind of jump on board this. So if that group starts in 1810, the Triennial Convention starts in 1814, the good historian in each of us should ask, well, why? Right? Why did Baptist churches feel that they needed to start their own mission-sending agency? Now, again, let me name those groups: Presbyterians, Congregationalists, German Reformed churches, others. What do those groups all share in common? Anybody know? Sprinkling or infant baptism. That's exactly right. And so they have differences, right? They have differences ecclesiologically. They have differences in a variety of ways. But for Baptists, it's more than just an ecclesiological difference. It's a difference of the Christian life. Like, at what point are you in the church? At what point are you at what point are you a Christian? Are you a Christian because your parents moistened your forehead, or are you Christians because of a public profession of faith in Christ Jesus followed up by believer's baptism? So that the distinction of baptism, though at first glance looks like an artificial one, right? Believer's baptism is a deep ocean. It's a deep ravine that connects to a lot of other theological categories. And so you couldn't legitimately ask missionaries or Baptist churches to support missionaries who are going to go overseas and help fund and support churches that are committing to practices that are so alien to the Baptist understanding of what the New Testament church ought to be, right? Does that make sense? Right? So Baptists understood that in their context that they needed to create something like the ABCFM, but for Baptists, so that the missionaries would share in their understanding of the importance of believers' baptism, the importance of the Christian life, the importance of the local church, and so on, okay? So, Triennial Convention is formed in 1814, but from the very beginning, now this is probably going to be super surprising to everybody, but from the very beginning there is conflict, right? Because there's all the Baptist churches are Great Commission churches. They want to see the gospel proclaimed to the nations. They want to see the gospel proclaimed to the nations. They want to see missionaries sent out They want the light of the gospel everywhere. But the question is, how? How do we do this? And so one of the things that we see in the early days of the Triennial Convention is a tension, a debate within the convention over whether or not the Triennial Convention is going to function as a convention of churches or a society of individuals. Now that sounds like, what's the difference, right? You're just using the same words to describe two different things. But if you think about it, this is actually two very different ways of approaching missions, right? So for churches to come together as a convention is a body composed of churches cooperating together in a variety of areas, typically more centralized and geographically defined. So members of a convention are churches, right? So for instance, the Southern Baptist Convention, right? Even today, I, Joe Garner, am not a member of the Southern Baptist Convention. I am a member of a Southern Baptist church. Emmanuel Baptist Church is a member of the Southern Baptist Convention. Does that make sense, right? So conventions are made up of local churches. They come together, they associate together to meet particular ends, okay? Now, a society model is different. A society model looks more like a Christian nonprofit organization. A society model is more like Operation Christmas Child, or a campus ministry. I mean, BCM, Baptist Collegiate Ministry, is not quite that, because it's a ministry of a state convention. But there's other campus missions organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, RUF, Reformed University Fellowship, those kinds of things. They're societies. In other words, they're individual-based support. And they're made up of individuals and sometimes also churches that are focused on one particular ministry. Okay? So where's the tension? Where's the rub? The earliest tension is within the Triennial Convention is, are we going to be a convention of churches, or are we going to be a missions organization that's funded by individuals, by churches, by all sorts of things? Does that make sense? That's the distinction between the two. And really what it boils down to is a debate, an argument over the creation of a centralized body. Okay? So in other words, if a bunch of churches are going to get together to accomplish something, are we getting together to form a new organization, or are we just like sharing a bank account to pay for a missionary? Does that make sense, right? Those are kind of two very different models. And you can see how that tension you can see how that tension kind of even lasts to today. This is a tension that never really goes away. One of the reasons the Southern Baptist Convention is created, right? Again, I don't want to steal too much thunder from Dr. Matz, but that's okay. He's not here. One of the reasons the Southern Baptist Convention is created, we always hear, well, it was about slavery. Yes, right? Yes, it was. But it was also about this tension between society and convention, because Northern Baptist churches were more society-minded. They wanted a more loose, individual association type of arrangement, whereas Southern churches, while yes, wanted to be able to send missionaries who were also slave owners, Southern churches typically were more comfortable with a convention model. This is one of the ironies, I think, of Baptist history, is all this tension, this debate is happening at the same time that on the political level, right, the South wants its individual liberty, it's states' rights, it's decentralized government. And it's the North that wants the more centralized government. But in Baptist circles, it's the Baptists, when it comes to a missions agency, the Southern Baptists in the South want a more centralized missions agency, and the Northern churches want a more decentralized, individualistic sort of missions apparatus. That's super ironic to me, but anyway. So what I'm getting at here is it's not a question of who loves missions and who hates missions. It's a question of what is the best way? What's the best way of sending missionaries? But it's even more foundational than that because it also depends on how we emphasize the autonomy of the local church, right? Because this is kind of the rub. This is what many, especially Northern Baptists in the North, were afraid of. To go to a convention model was one step toward what they would call popery. Now, it's not the smell good stuff you put on, the little flower things you put on the back of your toilet, right? But, popery is in the pope, right? As in an ecclesiological structure, right? So those that wanted to resist the convention model, they wanted to push back against the convention model and to have mission societies, more individual, more kind of free reign, less organized, is they didn't want a denomination. They didn't want a denominational apparatus because they felt like that threatened the autonomy of the local church. Whereas the convention model, it's not that it's not necessarily that they didn't want popery. They didn't want a pope. They didn't want a Baptist pope. They didn't want Baptist bishops. But they knew that the kind of organization it takes to send out missionaries internationally takes a certain level of organization, takes a certain level of administration, it takes a certain level of apparatus to be able to do it on a large scale. Does that make sense? So this is the tension, this is the argument. And not only is it about missions, but it's about other things as well. Because one of the things that pops up in the Triennial Convention is as soon as the Triennial Convention is kind of comes about, I got ahead of my notes here. Let me catch back up. As soon as the Triennial Convention comes about, there are those within the Triennial Convention that want it to do more. So there are those, and again, particularly those from Southern churches. They want the Triennial Convention not only to send missionaries, but they want the Triennial Convention to start seminaries. They want the Triennial Convention to start publishing houses, right? To publish Bibles, to publish Sunday school curriculum, to publish books and theology books and these sorts of things, Bible studies, all the things that we kind of take for granted, right? That was what the society folks, and especially, again, not all, but mostly Northern Baptists, wanted to avoid, right? Because they were afraid of that centralization, okay? All right, any questions up to this point? All right, so I've just got a couple more minutes. So let me kind of set the stage. So for the big break, right? So the Triennial Convention forms in 1814, meets every 3 years. The very first meeting, they form a foreign mission agency. So like we have the International Mission Board. The Triennial Convention forms the American Baptist Missionary Unit. They start sending out missionaries to China, to Africa, to South America. State and regional Baptist conventions are also formed kind of in the pattern of the Triennial Convention. The Triennial Convention also creates a publishing arm, so the Baptist General Tract Society, later renamed the American Baptist Publication Society, is created in 1824. The Home Mission Society is created in 1832. I hope this all sounds familiar, because when you get to the Southern Baptist Convention basically just Xeroxes all that and kind of changes the names a bit and starts kind of from scratch, right? So by 1840, we get to the point where Baptists are in basically every state and territory, as well as in missions around the world. And part of this is because of the cooperative efforts of the Triennial Convention. Now, let's shift gears. Let's narrow our conversation down to an individual. So eventually, in 1814, one of the first presidents, really, I think Furman is the first president, if not maybe the second. But in one of the first or second president of the Triennial Convention is a pastor named Richard Furman. Okay? So Richard Furman is from South Carolina, and he's the pastor of, wait for it, First Baptist Church of Charleston, right? Our old friend, right? Amongst the regular Baptists, First Baptist Church of Charleston. Now remember, First Baptist Church of Charleston is part of that regular Baptist strain. And they are, generally speaking, much more, the Southern Baptists in the South, we talked about the Charleston tradition, the Sandy Creek tradition. At this point, now it's going to change by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, but at this point, the Charleston tradition is dominant between the two, okay? And Richard Furman is obviously pastor of the First Baptist Church of Charleston. He's one of these Charleston tradition guys, and he and those in the Charleston tradition are much more comfortable with the convention model, with creating seminaries and colleges and more organized missions efforts and these sorts of things. Furman thought that the Triennial Convention, yes, should be about foreign missions, but should also be about education, so seminaries, colleges, should also be about home missions, and should also be about what he called Baptist unity. And what he meant by that is confessionalism, right? So the Triennial Convention would also provide theological accountability for Baptist churches who were members of it. Now, what Furman wanted was exactly what the society model folks did not, right? Furman is everything the society model guys within the Triennial Convention didn't want any part of. So he's a firm supporter of the convention model over the society model. Side note, not really a side note, very important later, but we'll save this for Dr. Matz. Richard Furman also is an owner of slaves. And so he is part of the what's going to happen in the split amongst the Triennial Convention over what to do with those who are appointed missionaries who are slave owners. Because even by the time we get to the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, especially into the 1850s, these divisions are these national political, moral, religious divisions are obviously affecting the Triennial Convention as well. And so Furman and others' leadership in the Triennial Convention ultimately leads to division. So, obviously he has a strong support for the convention model, so that's one big break. And then also he is a proponent of the ability of the Triennial Convention to send missionaries who own slaves. In fact, Furman leads the Charleston Association of Churches to adopt one of the most strongly worded, I would even call it a militant defense of slavery in 1835. The Charleston Association passes one of the most strongly worded resolutions in support of slavery that year in 1835. Whereas the Northern leadership, not only are they more hesitant, they're not necessarily full abolitionists at this point, but they're much more hesitant to the kind of gung-ho support of slavery that many of the Southern churches are, but they're also much more, as I said, much more kind of society-orientated. By the time we get to the 1820s, a shift begins to happen within the Triennial Convention. And you get more and more Northern Baptist pastors and leaders begin to be voted into leadership positions within the Triennial Convention, so they're able to kind of write rules and rewrite rules regarding who can be sent as missionaries and who can't. And so, whereas early in the history of the Triennial Convention, Baptists in the South were in leadership. By the time we get closer to the middle of the 1800s, Northern Baptists are more in leadership areas within the Triennial Convention. Now, obviously, the slavery question becomes a growing concern nationally at every level of society, even amongst churches. The convention boards attempted to claim at first a position of neutrality, but honestly, it's not even possible, right? And so what eventually happens, and I'm going to end here, what eventually happens is you have two big cases, what's called the two test cases. Dr. Matz will talk about these here soon. But the two test cases are essentially instigated by leaders in the South to force the question, to force the attempted neutrality over the slavery issue. But honestly, also what's kind of going on behind the scenes is this kind of society versus convention model. So, middle of the 19th century, middle of the 1800s, you have Baptists across the United States, more or less in every nook and cranny. They're large enough to begin to associate in national gatherings, particularly for the sending out of missions. They really, ever since the War of Independence, they are becoming more politically influential, not nearly to the degree they are after World War II, but they're becoming much more politically influential, and they, like every other aspect of society, in a season of prosperity in the early 1800s, they all kind of run crashing into the issue of slavery, the issue of North and South, of states' rights, the growing tensions within the country. Let me just give you an example of what I mean by that, and then real quick we'll finish. So when I talk about the growth and the institutionalization of Baptists in the United States, I'll just let me throw out some dates here. So 1835, we have the Missouri Baptist Convention has its first meeting, or one of its, I think it's its first, it's either 1835 or 1836, has its first meeting, okay? The Southern Baptist Convention officially forms, so spoiler alert, the Triennial Convention gets split, and part of it forms the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention forms in 1845. The SBC forms. In 1858, I don't know why I did that. 1850C. In 1858, anybody knows what happens in 1858? Hannibal LaGrange is founded. Now, obviously not here, but in LaGrange. Starts off at LaGrange College, but Hannibal LaGrange is founded 1858, and then of course the Civil War breaks out in 1861. So in these decades before the Civil War, this is where we're going to kind of end our Baptist story, for at least American Baptists, we find an inevitable arc towards institutionalization. I don't mean like putting someone in a mental institution, but an inevitable arc of forming organized national or state level bodies. This begins in the early decades of the 1800s, and it's not just us. Other denominations are almost mirror doing the exact same thing. The Civil War kind of cracks this a little bit because many institutions kind of don't survive the turmoil of the Civil War, but after the Civil War, these institutions that make it through their infancy through the Civil War are more solidified and then move into the early 20th century into the 1900s, so that by the time we get to 1925, the Southern Baptist Convention has operated for little less than 100 years by that point, with without a formal national kind of organizational apparatus. So the executive committee, for instance, even the Baptist Faith and Message comes in 1925. This kind of institutionalization of Baptists really kicks into high gear even after the 1900s. But the point I want you to see here in the 1800s is as Baptists grow, the division from the Civil War begins to come. But many of the agencies, many of the denominational apparatus that we think of as everyday and normal today really has its root in the early 1800s. All right, guys, well, I'm way over, but shouldn't be surprising for my last one. So we're going to end it there. Thank you guys so much for your attention this summer. I really appreciate you guys quite a bit. Lord willing, we'll do this again at some point, and keep your ear open. I think Pastor Anthony will let you guys know what the schedule is going to be. I don't know if Dr. Batts is starting this coming Sunday or the following Sunday, but I know he's going to be picking up kind of the birth of the Southern Baptist Convention and then at least up through the conservative resurgence in the 1980s and 90s, at least through that point. So thank you all so much. You guys are dismissed. Have a good evening.